welcome. It is see so many familiar faces, and I know the faces at the front of the room are already familiar to you, but I'm going to take a moment of privilege to introduce them again to you. First, I'm Julie Bailey. I'm alumni and church relations person here at the seminary. Is my mic going in and out? Okay. Welcome to this panel discussion with three historians. First, I'd like to introduce you to Justo Gonzalez. She's a professor emeritus of Okay. We're live. Let's start over. We are pleased to have three amazing historians in our midst. First, we have Dr. Catherine Gonzalez. She is Professor Emerita of Church History here at Columbia. In addition to her teaching career, she is also an ordained Presbyterian minister who has led and served in a variety of committees for the church and has been particularly instrumental in fostering interfaith relationships at the denominational level. We could go on, but I'll stop there. Her husband, Justo Gonzalez, is an historical theologian and a Methodist elder. He is a prolific writer and an influential contributor to the development of Latin theology. He and Catherine have co-authored several books, which you can see outside the chapel. Their works can be explored also at the Justo and Catherine Gonzalez Resource Center, which you will hear more about at the end of this panel. And finally, we have Professor William Yu. William teaches at Columbia. He is our Associate Professor of American Religious and Cultural History. He is the author of several books, including What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism, the Presbyterian Church, and a newly released title, Reckoning with History, Settler Colonialism, Slavery, and the Making of American Christianity. Welcome. I thought we'd start with having each of you answer a couple of questions, maybe 5 minutes or so. And then if you in the audience have a question or two, be thinking of those and we'll have them answer them at the end. So historians, as Brennan has graciously, eloquently reminded us, 2025 is a hard year already. Many in this room are pastors or teachers or chaplains. Can you help us place ourselves in a larger context of Christianity so that we can gain a larger perspective and possibly be inspired by, or at least informed by, our history so that we can live faithfully into the future? Who would like to go first?
In time that, in the past history of the church, that seems most like a good comparison for what we're going through is probably the 5th and 6th century. It's the point in the Western Church where the Western Roman Empire is falling. New groups of people, some called them barbarians, some called them Germanic tribes, but whatever they were, particularly climate change was causing them to be on the move. The Chinese decided to create a wall so they wouldn't come there. And it seems to me there are two things. First of all, it was the church in the West, there's an echo, it was the church in the Western Roman Empire that suffered the greatest exposure to these tribes coming in. The empire was basically Christian. The tribes were not. It was the West that fell. It was the tribes that conquered. What the church had to deal with at the time was, first of all, the real destruction of the state. And that's one of the things that I keep thinking of in the past month, that so many of the services of the state seem to be shaking on very slippery ground, whether they will survive, which means the services for the people at the margins of society, the people the most dependent upon the services. And we have to remember that those services became part of the state because of the Christians. They were not viewed as something the state had to do with. It was the Christians who said, these have to be done, and when the state became Christian, the state began to take over some of those services, and I think that's something we have to remember. But it means, I think, in the future, and I don't know how immediate a future, but as services cease to be provided to the people who need them most, I think it calls into question how the church can come in to take over services that the state once provided, which were at the inspiration of the church to begin with. So that's thing number one. The other part of that, the century, that I don't know of any other century beyond our own and the 20th where migration was such of overwhelming character. The movement of peoples from where they started to where they ended up. And they never ended, they kept moving. But we have that at the moment. And the thought that they are all going to go home is simply not a thinkable thought. There's not that much transportation in the world to do that. The question of how we deal with constant changing populations and how the church is related to that. But the majority of people coming into this country, with or without documents, the majority of the people coming into this country are Christians. And they are coming from vibrant churches. We are seeing most of our churches with gray hair. The future of our churches may depend on these immigrants. The vitality of churches may depend on them. The young people, you go to a church that's basically an immigrant church, and they are overrun with children. And there are things of that nature that I think we have to have in mind, both the positive and what the church needs to look at in its own surroundings as things are changing. But they are changing very, very rapidly.
Well, I could deal with that question on two levels. One level is the world as a whole and the place of the church in it. But basically the world, what's happening in the world, and the other is what's happening in the church. Let me begin with the last one, what's happening in the church. There's a distinguished colleague who ought to be here in this panel. He's sitting back there. It's Erskine Clark. And I remember when Erskine had just returned from a sabbatical in Cambridge. He quoted a professor at Cambridge who began his speech by saying, "Now that Christianity is in decline throughout the world." And my comment to Erskine was, yes, that's true, if Cambridge is the world. You know, it's part of what's happening is there's such a huge shift, a huge geographical shift in the whole church and cultural church. And the U.S. church is at the bad end of it. The European churches are ahead of us in that bad way. I remember when I first came to the Board of Missions of the United Methodist Church in New York, that still was called the Board of Missions. They had this big map with all the countries coloring in different religions and so on. And red was for Christians. Dark red for Catholics, sort of a very light red for Protestants, something in between for Orthodox. The whole north was red. And there were little spots down there and down here. First of all, that you could not even try to make such a map today, because people are all scattered and move around and so on. But also, the experience that the churches are having here is experience that the church has had many, many times before. The growth of the church is not just from the center out and out now. Very often, the center itself moves. I could go back to, even the book of Acts. I have been rereading the story of the famous Council of Jerusalem, so-called Council of Jerusalem. And I am trying to sit myself there in the place of the disciples, the Judean disciples, who now are having to deal with all this stuff that Paul and others are doing. And the history of the Jerusalem church is sad. It's sad because, first of all, they no longer have a central role. Not one piece of the New Testament was written in Jerusalem. It was all written outside. And then, the whole story. By the year 70, there's a war, and the whole place is destroyed, and they have to flee. And by the year 100, the Sanhedrin includes a prayer in the ritual condemning all the Christians, all the Galileans, and so now they have completely to break with the synagogue. And I can imagine what it would have been to have been a Jewish Christian in that latter half of the first century. And I think in some ways, somehow, they managed. And what they had done continued, not with them, but continued someplace else. So that's one thing I want to say. It has happened again. I mean, later the center of Christianity became sort of the Mediterranean, and both the African coast and the European coast were the center of it. And then that went away, and then it became a line that goes from the British Isles down to Rome and so on. You can go on and on and on. In the time when I was growing up, it was a line that went across the North Atlantic. Right now, when I was growing up, the two centers of missionary work were New York and London. Today, there are more Puerto Ricans doing missionary work in New York than New York, the whole of New York, of all denominations, sends to the whole world. Now, that's a little bit of a change. Now, that's one thing. The other thing I want to say is that I want to go back to the period that Catherine was talking about, the invasions, because the invasions were a shock for the people who had been used to living in the settled areas. They lived in the greatest empire of their time. The empire was in favor of the church. Everything was good. The 4th century produced most of the great leaders of the early church, the great famous preachers, the famous historians, the famous theologians. Everybody sort of fits in that 4th century. And then suddenly, the people that Catherine referred to as Germanic people, so it's not to call them barbarians because they happen to be her ancestors, and also most of ours. But anyhow, but they come over and they destroy everything. 410 was it when we were kids. That's what they told us. That's what the ancient society and antiquity ends and the Middle Ages begin, and so on. And Augustine hears about that. He also hears all the fault of Christians. These Christians have messed it all up. And because the Christians have messed it up and the old gods have been abandoned, now Rome has fallen. We have to go back to the gods. He writes a famous book, The City of God. Working with him was a young man who was from Galicia, from the northern corner of what's now Spain, who had already begun to write something similar. So they were working together. And Augustine's answer very quickly basically is that the book is called the City of God. That's a misnomer, because the word city in that time did not mean an urban center only. It also meant a whole system of government, a whole society, a whole state, as you call it today. So the Romans have two words. I mean, when they talked about the date, they did not say from the date of the founding of the city of Rome. They call it urbe condita, from the foundation of the herb. See, they had the word herb, from which you get urban, which means is that. But the city could be this, but it was also. When he talks about two cities, he's not talking about two places with walls around one. He's talking about two systems of government, two ways of organizing the world. And obviously, you know the story. He says that there are two ways the world is organized. One is in the love of self, and the other is in the love of God. And the city that's founded on the love of self is the earthly city, and no earthly city can prevail, can live forever, because it has within itself the seeds of its own destroying. It has good reason. I mean, and if you go back from that, goes on to what we learned in school later about the social contract. The social contract is basically the same idea. We make a contract because it helps us all. Because it helps us all, we establish this covenant, and that's what society becomes. And Augustine doesn't say that that's necessarily bad. On the contrary, that's the way people organize because of who they are. But any such city would not long stand. And so he's saying Rome fell not because of the barbarians, not because of the Christians, but it fell because every city is destined to fall. And I think that's important for us today, because I think we have to distinguish between the interesting of a nation that we love, and we should love, and the interest of the city of God. And just as before Augustine died, when the Vandals were practically next to the city, but they took it a few months later. But that young man who was working with him, Paulus Orosius, had gone back to his land and found everything destroyed. His home was destroyed. There was nothing left there. And then he wrote and he said, if the only reason why God has allowed the Vandals and the Suevi and the Goths and others to come into our land, is so that they may get to know the love of God. May God's grace be praised. Now, he loved the Roman Empire. He loved his family. He loved his land. But he was able to make a hierarchy of those laws. And I think that's what Christians are called to do today. How do we love above all the city of God? Anyhow, I think that's enough. That's more than 5 minutes probably.
So the Christian faith is a lot of different kinds of faith all in one. It is a biblical faith, perhaps lowercase b for many of us here at Columbian Seminary. It is an apostolic faith. It is a spiritual faith. It is a personal faith. It's a communal faith. And as Drs. Catherine and Justo Gonzalez are teaching us this afternoon, it is a historic faith. It is a faith that has been passed on to us. And so for Christians today, I do think what I wrestle with and what we wrestle with is that, in thinking about the historic faith, some of it is good and some of it is inspiring. We are inspired by, for example, Augustine's City of God. We're inspired by Christians who spoke out against empire, who protested dehumanization and oppression. At the same time, we're mindful in this historic faith, some of our ancestors were also oppressors. Some of our ancestors manipulated and twisted the Bible to achieve, whether it be nationalistic, political, economic, and selfish aims. And all of that is a part of it. Justo writes in the first 5 pages of his 2-volume The Story of Christianity that there is a faithful witness, but there's also contradictory witness. And so for me, in a lot of my work, what I found is that, and what I cling to and what inspires me, it is the recognition that for those that believed in the good news of the gospel, to speak out against what was wrong, to protect those on the margins and the weak. At the same time, again, there were those that did not. But I think also what Justo writes on those first 5 pages is that as we understand the fullness of the past, we are not like in bondage to it. We learn it all. We see how it has colored our present and has informed and shaped our present, and we can choose. We can choose which parts to affirm and which parts to reject. And so for me, in writing my last book on Presbyterian history and slavery, and it is an awful history, it's a history with a lot of complicity and some wickedness, if not a lot of wickedness. When I was writing it and talking about it with people, I do think one thing that was odd was that some said in Presbyterian churches, oh, it's because of the Reformed faith. Oh, it's because of depravity. Oh, it's the frozen chosen thing, right? That Presbyterians didn't want to get involved and were kind of passive, as if something was inherently wrong with the Reformed tradition or Presbyterianism. And what I would say is that Presbyterianism was not the problem. Some Presbyterians were, though, and I'm able to differentiate between the two. And one thing I share often with people is that the American Anti-Slavery Society, the largest abolitionist, first national abolitionist organization, founded in part by William Lloyd Garrison in 1833 in New York City. The first annual report has the executive committee, really early in the report. And there are 12 men that are there, and many of them are clergy. And what I found, though, is that I couldn't identify exactly what denomination all of them were, but I'm sure that 6 of the 12 men, 4 white men and 2 black men, were all active Presbyterians. 2 black men, Theodore S. Wright, the first graduate at Princeton Seminary, class of 1828. Samuel Cornish, one of his mentors in New York City. Samuel Cox, a pastor in New York City. John Rankin, really involved in the Underground Railroad in Ripley, Ohio, with his wife, Jean Lowry Rankin. That's 4. And then Arthur and Louis Tappan, these 2 wealthy merchants, ruling elders at a Presbyterian congregation in New York City. So all 6 of at least these men and many more, what they found in the Bible and what they found in the Presbyterian and Reformed traditions, what they found in it was ammunition for good. They found inspiration in it, such as Luke 4, the idea that Jesus, at the onset of his ministry, to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, to set free or to set at liberty those who are oppressed. That and other passages, all of that, they said, this is, even though our backs are against the wall, and even though it's really hard, because slavery is so engrafted in the American society, both South and North, we see that there is a better way. We see that there is, in God and in the gospel, and in the historic faith and the churches that they inherited and inhabited, we see that there is good. Of course, there is also bad. And so what I do want to say is that it's not wrong for us to learn the bad, because the bad helps us understand where we are today. But I don't think it needs to be a fatalistic endeavor. That when some bad stuff is uncovered and some skeletons that come out of the closet, oh man, I can't believe that's my church. I can't believe that's my faith. I can't believe Christianity, right? It's not that. Although some of it, sometimes, and I think it's okay to feel like that, some of it is pretty awful stuff. But at the end, we can say, we can cling to the hope and the good. And again, for me in this room and what I share with people is that, and I don't want to get triumphalistic about it, that Christianity is better than everything else or anything like that. But for me, what I want to do is say, I don't think Christianity in and of itself, or there is enough in it I don't think that is the problem. And I don't think history is the problem or the church today is the problem. I do think the problem, though, if we're really honest, the problem is in part some Christians. There are some bad faith Christian witnesses out there. And I want to say that partly with anger, because, you know, Jesus was angry too and he didn't like the Pharisees, but partly with compassion, knowing that for some, there is some delusion and self-delusion, and there are some like clinging to these bad faith Christian practices and beliefs and churches because they are desperate, because they are struggling. They're struggling socially, culturally, economically, and I get all that. So that's what I would say is that I think it's both. I am simultaneously angry and hopeful all the time. And I do think that is what it is to be a Christian in the historic faith that we have inherited and that we inhabit as we try to do what's right today.
Thank you, William. That's exactly where I want to go next with this next question, is how do you find inspiration? How can we as Christian leaders in 2025 find inspiration, joy, and liberation in our work? And I'm going to pass the mic because I think it's going to work better.
I find inspiration in going into churches that are largely immigrant churches. I mean, I find overwhelming encouragement. I keep thinking, now would not be the time to try it, say maybe last July or something. If you tried to take in Greater Atlanta, how many Christians are in church on Sunday morning? I don't know how you'd find out, first of all, but there are so many churches we don't even know about. They aren't registered with anybody. I don't even know that they have a phone number that's listed somewhere. They are a group of immigrant Africans, a group of immigrant Central Americans, all sorts of varieties. And I have a feeling that what is true now in this country is probably what was true in Britain quite a while ago, that on any given Sunday morning, the number of people who are in church on any Sunday morning, the immigrants outnumber the Anglicans. And I think that's probably true I wouldn't be surprised if it were true in Greater Atlanta. But we don't know these churches. And yet when you go into one, you are shocked by the number of people, by the number of children. You can be shocked by a whole variety of things, but it's fascinating. And it is encouraging. And I think we need to find ways to bridge the gap between the churches that get listed and whose members are counted on any survey, and these churches that we really don't know about unless they meet in our church. But there are hundreds of them, and I think they need to be much more appreciated and known and encouraged, and links made with them.
Well, first of all, let me begin by saying amen to what Catherine is saying. We attend a local Presbyterian church that's very friendly, completely committed to all kinds of social action and service, with a great preacher. We enjoy that. But I need every once a month or so to go to an immigrant church, because there's something there different there. And you just need it. I don't know whether it's spiritual or just psychological, but I need that shot. Okay? The Hispanic probably being able to praise God in God's language. That's by the way, the Bible, Dr. Bryn should know that the Bible was not originally written in Hebrew. It was originally written in Spanish, and God translated it into Greek and Hebrew because nobody knew Spanish yet. Okay? But anyhow. At a deeper level, I get my inspiration at the very, very core of the Christian faith. And on the third day, we were not called to be great. Well, at least not in the way the world understands great. You know, the word great has been, everybody has been had these days. You can make it great. And I was reading, looking at one of those pictures while reading Luke 22. You know, among the Gentiles, what do? The kings lord over them, and they are called great. But not so among you. Among you, the great is the one who serves. And I think if you want to have a great church, it has to be a serving church. I get very concerned when it seems that my own denomination, and some others that are represented here that would not be mentioned, seem to be more concerned about keeping the structure going than keeping the service going. And it may be that what we are to do is take again the basic message of Jesus, take your cross and follow me. And that's not just you and me, it's the church. It may be that the church has to go through a cross. It may be that the only way that the church can live is if it dies. But let me tell you, there's a third day. And it's that third day that keeps me going.
So I think perhaps a generation ago, it was very difficult to talk about difficult things. For example, to talk about social and racial issues, social racial justice in congregations. So a lot of it, even when I read things from the 1960s, a lot of the call from black ministers and white allies were, we need to talk about it. Please talk about it in your churches. Don't be afraid. I think I am inspired and hopeful is that we are talking about it more. And I don't want to overstate it and say everywhere. But I do sense that there is more momentum and more energy and more willingness to talk about it. So I think that is hopeful and that is inspiring. But probably in 2025, the next step as we gather here is that, and I don't mean this in like a bad way or a condemning way, but probably we need to talk better about it than we have. And I mean that in both ways. I mean that for those who lean right, to talk about it with openness and not walk out of the room at the first mention of something that is disrupting or disturbs one's understanding of faith, the church, nation, etc. But also for those who lean left, it would be also not to get angry and not to walk out of the room or not to scream at someone when there are genuine questions and there are genuine like, help me understand that, I really want to figure that out. And I'm not going to be able to express it like, this is my first time in ways that might be like patable, or that I might ruffle some feathers and I might offend, but to just kind of stay in it together. And how do we do that? So one example for me is that, when looking back at European travelogues from French and English travelers and writers like de Tocqueville and others who came to the United States in that kind of period, the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, the rise of a nation. Of course, some of that is bad because economically it was through dispossession of indigenous lands and enslavement of black people. But they did kind of marvel because their countries were not a democracy, France and England. But they did marvel that the United States was trying to do this genuinely noble democratic experiment. The idea that these citizens in this country, our country, believe that a nation works best when its citizens elect its leaders. Now we know that that's true in many places, but in the 1820s and 30s, it was really kind of like they were doing ethnography. It was like a novel concept. How does this all work out? And so Frances Trollope, one of the British writers, she noted, and several others did, but it caught my eye. She said, it is kind of odd though. I get the democracy thing, and I get that Americans are excited about it, but she said, politics is really strong and partisanship in this country. And her example, and she's a good writer, she says, I forget if it's walking down the street or I'm in a room somewhere, and she says, one American shouts, Clay forever, like Henry Clay. Like his whole identity was subsumed in support for Henry Clay, the Kentucky politician. And another American shouts, Jackson forever. noting that one's own identity and one's own worth was tied to Andrew Jackson and his presidency. And she said that was strange, because in England, that really didn't happen. Of course, you honor the royalty and the monarchs and the like, but the sense of like one's identity being wrapped up in a presidential like candidate, it was really strange to her. And I shared this, and it connected with me, and she's writing in the 1830s, because doesn't that sound a lot still like what is happening today? So I think one thing for me to say is that I think I just need to admit that that is in our DNA. I don't think it's healthy when it's like everything, when everything is tied into the names of a few different candidates for president, whether it be Obama, Biden, Trump, Harris, and the like. But I do think there is a part of it that is part of democracy. So I think it's naive to say politics don't matter and partisanship doesn't matter, and that doesn't belong in church and that doesn't belong in faith. It is a part of who we are. But then the challenge becomes, like, how do we temper that or balance that with the call of the gospel? How do we be both patriotic and faithful, recognizing that sometimes they align really well, and sometimes faith will challenge our patriotism. Faith will cause us to enlarge in our vision of what it means to be moral when we think about issues such as poverty and healthcare and immigration. So these are challenges, and these are things that I'm hopeful about, because I do feel like we're talking about it. And yeah, there are stumbles along the way, and sometimes we offend, and sometimes what does discourage me certainly is that when we talk about it, and it's like after the hour, everyone leaves more discouraged than we started. And so that's bad, and so I want that to be better. But I am hopeful because we are talking about it, and I'm especially grateful for pastors and faith leaders that are in churches where it is hard, for example, in this current age, with the rise of white Christian nationalism and real kind of connections, unhealthy connections between faith and politics. I'm grateful for those of you here, even in this room, who are pastoring in contexts like that. And sometimes it probably feels like you and your church are like this one little small light in a sea of real confusion and anger and vitriol and bitterness and just hate. And I'm grateful that you're there, and I'm grateful that your people are there. And I recognize for some of you, many of the people of faith in your congregation, they're aging, they are graying, if you will, and the like. But I'm grateful that you are there, that you are standing tall, that you are fighting the good fight, and that you're a beacon of hope for those. And it may be a trickle, it may be one or two people who've been burned by or hurt by the Christian faith tradition that they're coming from. But I do think it is good, and I just want to encourage you, like, to keep at it, even when you don't see the results today. It is the fruit of that ministry. I do believe, and I hope, I don't know for sure, right? But the fever has to break of what's happening now. And that's when I hope that you can find some of the fruits of the hard labor that you're doing now come to fruition.
I wonder if there are any questions from the audience. It's fine. I can't imagine there aren't any questions. Wait.
Immolating. Like Justo, I'm a United Methodist, and right now we're immolating ourselves. 30 churches in the West Virginia Conference where I serve are suing our bishop, our former bishop, former district superintendent, for acting in bad faith. I hear your word of hope, but I have to tell you that I preached my first sermon 58 years ago. Okay, it wasn't any good, but I was in one of those little country churches where they put you up when you're a teenager, and 250 years of Puritan theology, 250 years of Christianity. 250 years, and what do we get for it? We get selfishness enshrined in law and transactional relationships in government. and we get the leader of all that called the very choice of God. I have trouble staying encouraged. I mean, I'm wondering, Justo, I mean, you're watching what we United Methodists are doing, but 250 years of Christianity in this country, and this is where we are. Has our Christianity only been skin deep for 250 years? Or has it been more than that? I'll tell you where I draw my hope, and then I want your response. I draw my hope from the African American church. Talk about joy in the midst of suffering, in the midst of tribulation, in the midst of some of the worst things this world has ever produced. That's where I draw my hope. And I think the immigrant churches are doing the same thing. But I'm coming up on 35 years of pastoral ministry, and I'm retired, and I'm sick, and I'm old, and I'm grouchy, and I no longer watch my tongue and make people mad. But Justo, 250 years of Christianity in this country, and we get Donald Trump as God's chosen leader. I can't find any hope and joy in that. You Republicans will just have to forgive me for saying that. But I'm sorry. I'm ready to lay it down and say, to hell with it.
First of all, let me begin by saying that I have done many things and thought many things and so on that I'm sure God was tempted to say to hell with him. Okay? So let me begin by that. So I find it very difficult to say to hell with anybody because I belong there too. So that's the first thing. But then I think part of the problem is it's a very deep flaw in a certain kind of Methodist piety. We are building the kingdom. No, sir, we are not building the kingdom. The kingdom is not for us to build. We are rehearsing for the kingdom. And an ethical life is a rehearsal, learning for the kingdom. It is not a building of the kingdom. Because when you're building the kingdom, then when the kingdom seems to take a step back, you are defeated. The kingdom is not up to you. The kingdom is not up to the United Methodist Church, thank goodness. The kingdom is not up to the church. The church is up to the kingdom, which is a different matter. So that the only way I can put up with what's happening right now is by knowing whose is the victory at the end. Not trusting in our victories, which are very feeble and very passing and very easily destroyable, as we are seeing right now, but trusting in the kingdom that comes at the end. And I think that's what, again, by what Augustine meant. You know? We can build all kinds of nice cities, but ultimately, even the church is built on self-love as a society, as an organization. And all of those things are called to disappear because of its own very nature. The only thing that will sustain is the city of God, is love. Obviously, I go back to the whole question of greatness, because I think part of the problem is when we were right at the middle of the stage, we thought that we were great because we were there. I remember being at the board meeting of a seminary that should not go unnamed, but you can all know which it is. It's not this one. That used to have faculty that when they said a word, immediately appeared in the first page of the New York Times. And they were, wowing and wowing about how is it that we cannot do that anymore, and so on. Perhaps that's not what we were called to do at all. We ought to have done those comments, but we are not to think that that made us great. You know, that somehow we were something in the society. Among you, The great one is the one who serves. And then I also have to go back to radical monotheism. There's one of the heroes of Spanish history that when he saw the cadaver, the rotting cadaver of his queen, he said, "Never again will I serve a Lord who can die on me." And never again will I serve a Lord who can die on me. Okay? And I think that's what we're called to. We are not called to serve the nation. The nation is important. We have to call the nation to do good. We have to reject everything the nation that does bad. We have to acknowledge it. But we are not called to serve the nation. That's not our God. And as a suggestion, I will tell you what. If I were a pastor today, I will have my congregation study the Barmen Declaration again. The Barmen Declaration. Okay? Barmen. 90 years ago, in Germany, the church had gone to pot. They were serving an idol. It was more important for them to be German than to be Christians. It was theologically the most advanced country in the world, Christian country in the world. And a few Christians decided that's not what we believe in. And that's what we've got to do. I'm sorry I can't answer your question, but that's
One quick thing I'll share is, like for me, I would say I want to share my biblical faith. Faith is being sure of what we hope for, certain of what we do not see, Hebrews 11:1. And I want to share these things with people, but I don't want to insist upon it. Like, I don't need to leave our conversation with you, like me imposing my hope or my vision upon you. I think my task is to share it as clearly and compellingly and thoughtfully and respectfully as possible. But I don't insist upon it, upon anyone. And I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham City Jail, when he writes about how, he's 34 years old, but he's been in it for at least 8 years, from 55 with Rosa Parks in Montgomery. And he's like, I've traveled around the States now, and I've seen a lot of white churches. And I've seen all the activity that goes on there, and I've seen how big these churches are. And he says, and I weep tears, and he asks himself, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? I'm actually quoting verbatim from King. But then where I find hope is he says, but I want you to know that as much as I weep and as much as I question, there can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. And he talks about his love for God, and also his love for the church as a son and grandson of ministers. And for me, I would share, I think that's what faith is. Faith is the harmony of love and disappointment. Not actually that one melody overpowers and totally destroys the other, so much so that there is no more disappointment because love is there. I think this side of heaven, probably not going to happen. But it is that harmony. That's what faith sounds like. It is love and disappointment, just both notes being sung, sometimes quite loudly. And that's the sound of faith. I think for me, that's the sound of my faith. I am in love with God, I am in love with the church, and I'm in love with people all the time. And I'm always disappointed. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed by people. I'm disappointed by the church. And in my faith, I am disappointed in God. And I think that's what it is. And I hope that, and that sustains me. And I think that has sustained people before me, and that will sustain people after me. But again, in sharing it with you, sir, I don't insist upon it. I'm simply sharing how I'm making sense of what is happening today.
Before we close, I'm so sorry, but we have 2 minutes, and I wanted you to get to meet the executive director of the Gonzalez Center, and Tom Haygood. If y'all would come up and share a little bit more about the Gonzalez Center so people can find out more.
My name is Justo Gonzalez, and I am the director of the Justo and Catherine Gonzalez Resource Center, which is here in Decatur, Georgia. We are headquartered at the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. They have made room for us. But before and for transparency's sake, I am their niece. And he is my padrino, in Spanish, my godfather. And he has been very good at both all my life. I want to share a story with you because I too am a historian and I love stories. Many years ago, my husband and I were at a worship service at Columbia Presbyterian Church that Tom pastors. And it was a communion Sunday, and Tom invited the Miso congregation that was meeting in the same facilities for a joint service. I do not understand one word of Miso. I don't speak one word of Miso. But in that service, I was so moved. Not one word did I understand, but I knew that it was worship of God. It represented for me the fact that our faith is a universal church, that there's a multiplicity of voices that speak the words of praise, the words of love, the words of compassion. And it is only when we recognize and embrace that multiplicity can we begin to glimpse what the kingdom can be. As part of what we do at the at the Gonzalez Resource Center, we try to represent the Latin perspective. At the Resource Center, we hold the papers, mostly the unpublished papers, that Justo and Catherine have done over the course of their careers. Things like sermons, Bible studies, lectures, and we try to make those available digitally. Because the Resource Center is not just for Latins, it's for the whole church. It is so the church can hear yet one more voice raised in praise, raised in worship. It's one thing we do. The other thing that we do that I think is very important is that when you are part of a community that has traditionally been ignored, been shouted down, been spoken over, sometimes you need to hear that you're valued. Sometimes you need to hear that your voice matters. Sometimes you need to hear in a language that makes sense to you culturally. And that's what Justo does in his works. So that young teenager who's teaching Sunday school in the basement of their storefront immigrant church, through the Resource Center digitally has access to the works that Justo and Catherine have done. And she hears her own voice. She hears her own reality reflected by one of the premier theologians in this country, Latino or no. So we try to make those resources available to her and to the pastor of a big immigrant church. So that's part of what we're doing. We're trying to represent the voice of the Latin church, that immigrant church that Catherine talks about, that vitality, that is something we have to share. I hope you'll listen. I hope you join us in that effort to make these materials available. Most of all, through your prayers. Most of all, through your commitment and understanding that all voices matter. Everybody has a seat at the table. It is God's table. It is not ours. And God invites us all. We're just adding the garlic to the meal. But there is one way that you can actually support the center beyond just your prayers, and that's by becoming a friend of the center. Tom Haygood, one of your own, and William, you are both friends of the center. And Tom's going to talk to you a little bit more about that.
For the next 30 seconds, the first 10 callers who call in at know. I'm really here just to give you an ask today, because I think it's something that's important not just for us as pastors, but for the churches we heard about today, the immigrant churches, the African American churches, the Pentecostal churches that are scattered throughout all cultures, all religions, are looking for information to enlighten, to build their theology, understand their theological understanding, their relationship with God, and how to share that. And you have these wonderful resources at your fingertips. So I want to ask you today that if you want to have access to all of that wonderful material, and that includes 800 published and unpublished pieces of books and documents and sermons and lectures, I'm asking you to support the Catherine and Justo Gonzalez Center. Very simple. It doesn't take a lot of effort. You can go online. There's going to be some brochures that are sitting right outside the door there. For a mere $15, $20 a month, you can become a friend of the center and have access to all this information at your fingertips. And the other side of the equation is you will also have access to other pastors. And I think that's the important thing that we don't want to forget about. It's not just accessing information. You will have opportunities to collaborate with other pastors across the board, across all kinds of theological beliefs, and that, I believe, truly builds a community. And I think we're talking today about building community in the Christian church. So I do encourage you, please pick up a brochure and consider being an active supporting friend of the center. And if you're ever back here in Decatur, if you live locally, it's easy to find. You know McDonald's in downtown Decatur? They're across the street, catty corner from there. They have events, they have gatherings of pastors all the time. But if you can't be here in Decatur, you'll have access online to these materials. So please consider it. And I just want to say thank you to Justo and Catherine. I consider them wonderful friends. Sometimes it's not easy to stand up in front of them as a former student of them and preach, but they have been such a gift to me at my church. I want to be able for them to be a gift to you at your church. So thank you.
Please join me in thanking Drs. Gonzalez and Dr. Yu. What a privilege. Friends, we are now on a break. Our event